photographs and video recordings, as well as other documentary evidence. After listening to and questioning all of the witnesses and reviewing all of the evidence, the grand jury has determined that there is no basis to charge Tony Stewart with any crimes. His case was therefore no billed by the grand jury. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Were the toxicology reports part of the grand jury testimony, and can you tell us what the results of those reports were for both drivers?
There were no reports that were presented. There is toxicology evidence in the case relating to Kevin Ward that actually indicated that at the time of operation he was under the influence of marijuana. There was no toxicology work performed on Tony Stewart. However, a certified drug recognition expert had interviewed him on the night of the collision and determined that he found no basis to observe any alcohol consumption or impairment by drugs.
What exactly did you weigh, if you could share with us, in that testimony?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
What are some of the things the grand jury had to weigh that they heard from 2 dozen witnesses?
Well, they had, basically, I made it a goal to present every witness to the grand jury that had any possible relevant evidence to offer. So they did comprise, the witnesses, the various categories of personnel that I've described here. And their job was to determine whether or not, based upon all of the evidence that they heard, all the testimony that they heard, whether there was reasonable cause to believe that Tony Stewart had committed a crime or not. Obviously, their vote was that they did not reach that finding.
Hey Mike, we had heard that there had been a second video recording of the incident that occurred. What did that video show? Did it give you any other compelling information?
There were 2 videos. The first one, of course, was the one that everybody saw that had been posted on YouTube, but then the second video was the racetrack's own video. They were relatively similar in what they showed. Actually, the racetrack video was of a little higher quality. Those videos were examined in detail. They were enhanced. They were run through, allowed the frames to be isolated. They were run at 75, 50, and 25% speed. They were overlaid with grids and data, and they were a pretty important piece of the evidence that was considered here.
In the result, what did they tell you?
The videos? Well, the videos actually did not demonstrate any aberrational driving by Tony Stewart until the point of impact with Kevin Ward, at which point his vehicle veered to the right up the track as a result of the collision. Prior to that, his course was pretty straight.
You said that Kevin Ward tested positive for marijuana. Was it enough to impair judgment?
The levels that were determined were enough to impair judgment, yes.
In finding Tony Stewart essentially, free of guilt here, are we finding that Kevin Ward Jr. may have been at fault?
Grand jury was, of course, never tasked with the responsibility of anything other than to determine whether there was enough evidence to file charges against Tony Stewart. They were not considering whether anybody else was at fault. However, I am sure from their deliberations and discussions that the fact that Kevin Ward was observed running basically down 2/3 of the track into a hot track in the middle of other cars that were still racing played a big factor in their decision.
Mike, was Tony Stewart afforded the opportunity to testify at this grand jury?
He was given that opportunity.
And what did he say?
I didn't say he testified, I said he was given the opportunity. I really can't tell you who specifically testified or did not testify. And I can't tell you what they said in the grand jury. Okay?
How different is this case than others? I mean, the community was so involved in the case, that doesn't.
Well, obviously it's a high-profile case. You have more or less a celebrity in the racing world as the focus of the inquiry, so clearly there was a high level of interest in the case. When all is said and done, that should not and did not make any difference in this particular case. This was, presented to a grand jury. All available evidence was forwarded to them. They were very conscientious in their work on this case. They were actively involved. They asked a lot of questions, including some really excellent probing questions. They were very deliberative, and I'm very satisfied with the attention and conscientious work they put in on this case.
How long did they did they hear testimony? How long has this been going on?
The better part of 2 days.
2 days.
Yep.
Did they consider specific charges?
Yes, the charges that were submitted to the grand jury for consideration were manslaughter in the second degree and criminally negligent homicide.
And they would have had to find what for each of those?
They would have had, in New York State, it takes 12 or more votes of 23 grand jurors to return those charges. So while I can't tell you what their votes were, obviously you can deduce the fact that there were not 12 votes for either charge.
But the elements of those two charges?
Well, manslaughter in the second degree is essentially, and I'm just paraphrasing now, but it's essentially criminally reckless conduct. And criminally negligent homicide is just what it sounds. It's criminally negligent conduct. Both of those involve elements of carelessness that are much more rigid and much more demanding than ordinary civil recklessness or negligence involves.
Did the grand jury vote today or was that yesterday?
Their vote was today.
Given the nature of the evidence, what made you decide to present it to the grand jury to take that step ahead and then consider the case?
Well, there were probably several reasons. When I reviewed the investigation that had been prepared by the Sheriff's Department, it was clear that a number of the witnesses that were interviewed had different perspectives on what they had seen and what they had heard. There were, varying versions of what had actually taken place. So there was not one clear monolithic story that was presented to me. Additionally, several of the witnesses, important witnesses, chose not to make statements to the police. They did not want to make any statements. So the only way I could find out what they had to say or what they had to offer was to subpoena them and compel them to testify, which I did. And then finally, when you have a case of this magnitude, of this interest, I think it's important that the public knows that a large group of citizens drawn at random from the community heard all of the evidence in the case and collectively returned a judgment. I think it is something that people can rely on. That's important too.
Mike, how difficult is it taking a case like this to a grand jury when you're essentially tasked with trying to get inside the head of the person who you're viewing evidence against?
Well, it's not unlike most other cases that we present. As much evidence as possible is collected. That involves statements from witnesses to what they observed, statements from witnesses who may have spoken to important participants in this matter. There was a lot of technical work done. There was, as I said, 2 accident reconstructionists who worked on things like speed and distance and reaction times available and so on. And you do whatever you have to in a particular case to try to provide as big a picture as possible. And I think that's what was done in this case.
Have you contacted the Ward family to let them know the grand jury's findings?
Yes, I did speak with Mr. Ward.
How pleased were you?
Mr. Ward, I would suspect, was probably disappointed by the outcome, but he was very appreciative of the work that the Ontario County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office had put into the case.
What about Tony Stewart, reaction to the decision?
I have no idea what it is. I did notify his attorney of the outcome, but beyond that, I don't know. Any other questions?
And you said that this process took about 2 days. Did the jury deliberate for a specific amount of time?
They deliberated after the last witness finished testifying for a significant amount of time before returning their judgment.
Over an hour?
No, less than an hour, but yeah.
Can you speak to why the toxicology tests were not done on Stewart?
In New York State, law enforcement cannot compel any person to provide blood samples, urine samples, things of that nature, unless they have been arrested for a crime. Obviously, Tony Stewart was not arrested, therefore there was no legal basis for law enforcement to attempt to acquire that.
What about the track? I mean, is anybody looking into how things could be changed so this doesn't happen again?
Well, again, that's not the grand jury's function, that's not my function. That is really, if that's going to happen, that's going to be an internal discussion that they will have to have. Again, realistically, I think judgment is probably the most important factor in this case.
And you said you couldn't compel Tony Stewart to provide samples, but did you ask him or did you want those from him?
I don't believe law enforcement ever did that when they initially met with him. I don't know. In fact, I know that there was no request of him for that. As I said, a drug recognition expert did meet with him and speak with him, and it's a certified expert in New York State that requires a certain level of training, passing of examinations, things of that nature, and he determined that there was no basis to draw the conclusion of alcohol or drug involvement.
So your opinion on just what happened that night is what?
My opinion is that anytime a grand jury is given the opportunity to have a full and unfettered exploration of the circumstances of a case, that they are active, engaged, and involved and conscientious in their deliberations, then the system has worked, and whatever their judgment is one that should be respected.
Mike, what would you say the percentage of time that you get a grand jury that no bill's a case?
It doesn't happen very often. It happens occasionally. I can't quantify it for you. Obviously, a lot of cases that are lacking in evidence never even make it to a grand jury presentation stage. Others do, and in every case, a grand jury has the same responsibility. That is to decide if the evidence they hear rises to the level of reasonable cause to believe a crime was committed. No bills are not frequent, but they happen on occasion.
Did you expect this to be a no bill?
My expectations were that the grand jury would give this case a thorough look, and then whatever their determination was fine by me. I didn't go into it with any expectations.
Could you give us more details about the grand jury and the selection and who?
In New York State, grand juries are comprised of 23 citizens. They're drawn at random from a lot of different lists. Things like voter registration lists, vehicle registration lists, driver's license lists, property tax rolls, public assistance rolls, and perhaps 2 or 3 other databases as well. Names are drawn at random from that group. 23 are selected purely at random to serve on a grand jury. And in the more rural counties like Ontario, grand juries serve for terms of 3 months. Of the 23 people, it takes 12 jurors to ever return any affirmative action, to ever charge any crimes.
Mike, I know you can't speak directly about what witnesses said, but were there witnesses that were presented who had the impression that Tony Stewart did something malicious?
Again, I really am not going to get into characterizing individual witnesses' perceptions or testimony. As I indicated early on, one of the reasons I decided to present this case to the grand jury is that there were clearly different perceptions evidenced by different people on what they had seen and what they had heard. So when you have that kind of different views of the evidence, different views of what happened, sometimes it's necessary to present a case to a grand jury to really flesh out what the facts really are. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.